Now, if you think you can do that for 20 banks in 3 weeks and perform at your peak for each of those processes, then like, I want to meet you because you're Superman or Superwoman.
Hello and welcome to Graduate Theory. Today's guest is in his final year of Commerce and Law at the University of Sydney. He is a former investment banking intern at Macquarie, current investment intern at OIF Ventures, and an incoming grad at McKinsey. Please welcome to the show, Cheran Ketheesuran.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me. Love what you're
Welcome to
doing
the
with
show, mate.
the Grad Show podcast. And yeah, really humble that you've asked me on.
Nah, no problem at all, man. I've heard so many good things about you, and so many great things about the way you apply for roles, and kind of how much of a role model you are for lots of people that are currently going through, some of this process at the moment. I'd love to sort of wind back the clock and start perhaps from when you were first interested in going into sort of consulting, banking, VC, like this kind of very competitive fields, and kind of what was your first sort of intro into this kind of area?
Yeah, totally. It really was a bit of happenstance, I think, and some of it was probably um, deleting options off my interest list that left me with commerce. So to sort of set the scene, I remember in year 12, I think I was applying to Sydney Uni, wondering what degree I'd be doing. And law had always been a bit of an interest. And I remember if you read my scholarship application from back in the day, it talks all about wanting to be a human rights lawyer and wanting to help people. And commerce wasn't even on the faintest interest, really, in my view. And then eventually I sort of had some exposure to corporate law at Allen's for a little bit through some of their sort of pre-internship programs. Realized that I sort of wanted to do a job where you have to wake up every morning and you do need to know what's happened overnight. You do need to know what's happened overseas in markets. That
Mm.
constant stimulation was something that law really wasn't going to give me. So I knew pretty quickly that law wasn't going to be the path, and arguably should have dropped my law degree there. But that's a conversation for later. Spent some time over in DC doing government work. Had always loved government work, and did a bit of banking and finance over there too. And then when I came back to Sydney, I heard about this little thing called the industry placement program, which was a program run by, and still is a program run by Sydney Uni, where essentially you do a unpaid internship at it can be a bank, it can be a private equity firm, or any sort of commercey house, and it
Mm.
counts as one of your subjects as well. And I thought that was a really cool process. I didn't really have connections in the industry, and I ended up applying, ended up getting a spot, and it ended up being at a mid-market private equity firm called CP Capital. And at the time, I had no idea what CP Capital was. At the time, they were called Champ Private Equity. And I remember talking to one of my finance tutors who was a few years above. He was at Goldman at the time. I said, "Oh, I've got this gig at Champ Private Equity." And he usually just looked at me in disbelief, saying, "How on earth have you got into Champ Private Equity?" um, and then I said, "Oh, it's through the IPP at Sydney Uni." And then from there, I thought, okay, well, I'll probably do a bit of research and figure out who these guys are. And ever since then, that was my introduction. And I guess we can talk about the whole life cycle of my finance journey, but I definitely started at sort of the place where a lot of people end up, and it's only been
Mm.
going sort of backwards from there.
Nice, man. It's pretty cool. Yeah, it's sort of a surprise entry into commerce and finance. Because then you're sort of going through and you're into the world of investment banking and finance, and this whole process around internships and everything that goes along with that. I'd love to. I mean, I'm not super familiar with this process, so perhaps I'd love if you could sort of outline, if someone wants to sort of be a graduate at Goldman or wherever it is, what are the sort of steps
Mm,
required to do that, and kind of when do you need to sort of start thinking about these steps that kind of go into things?
sure. It is very much I call it the hedonic treadmill of internships sort of process, unfortunately. But if you take it all the way to sort of, how do I become a grad, first of all? So the sort of at most of the investment banks, both bulge and boutique, there are sort of two ways to become a grad. You either apply the year prior to your starting year as a grad immediately. So you might start, say you're meant to start in February of next year, 23, you would apply
Mm.
in February of 22 for a grad spot. I'd say that probably is about 30% of the graduate class positions come from there. The vast majority of positions, 60 to 70%, come from what's known as summer analyst role, which is essentially in your penultimate year of university. So your second last year of university, you do a 10-week, about ish internship
Mm.
over summer. So sort of start in December, end up in February, and from there there's sort of a conversion rate obviously of people who do the summer internship, and then end up getting a return offer, and then end up starting at the bank in the following year. So the best chance for candidates therefore is to become a summer analyst. Now, if we work backwards from there, what do we actually need to become a summer analyst? And I think this vastly depends, on your background, on the various things you've done during university. I think for me, I knew that banking experience was essential. It is pretty common to have done an investment banking internship of some sort prior to getting a summer analyst or a winter analyst role. Um, and for that reason, I think you'll see a lot of students sort of do a internship at a boutique. And a boutique is normally, say 5 to maybe 15 people.
Mm.
I personally did one at Greenstone Partners, and I was lucky in the sense that one of my best mates used to work at Greenstone Partners, told me that they were interviewing, and then I interviewed for the role with probably about, I don't know, 10 other people and ended up getting it. But that was crucial to me, and ultimately getting a role at Macquarie, because that sort of ticks the box of, okay, you're interested in banking. Why? Well, you've spent a year in banking, so
Mm.
having stayed so long there probably is a reason why you're interested for that. And then everything outside of that, and we can talk about these things when you get to the interview process, but a lot of the things outside of that are building up your core finance skills at university. There are still STEM programs and alternative pathway programs that come through, but as I mentioned, the hedonic treadmill is definitely, you know, boutique internship, winter, summer, and then a grad role. And I think that's what you'll commonly see on the LinkedIn progression of many
Mm.
students.
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting with that, like, there are many stories of, I mean, I think this happened to yourself, right? Where, well, I'm just thinking through, like, obviously the first step, that's going to help you a lot when it comes to the second step, which is going to help you a lot to get to the third step. And kind of, if you perhaps miss one of those steps, or then it makes things a bit more difficult, because then you're sort of coming up
Mhm.
against people that have done the steps in between.
Totally.
Um, because this happened to you, right? Like with
Yeah.
the winters. I'd love to sort of dive into that, and kind of how you approached, like,
Mm.
you're then getting this the summer internship, following that.
Totally. Yeah. So I was at Greenstone Partners, I started in late-ish 2020 and went through all of 2021. So we're talking now, it's say March 2021. I've started applying for the winter programs, and the idea with the winter programs is that a lot of banks like to lock up candidates early on, before the summer rounds come. And some of the banks as well, Goldman in particular, Bank of America, a few others, also give sort of summer spots immediately quite early on. So I remember applying to, it would have been most of the winter banks. I think Jefferies, Credit Suisse, UBS, quite a few of them. Got to the final rounds for most of them, but there was a pretty clear deficiency in each of those processes that led to a failure. So, for UBS, for example, it wasn't really being as on top of technicals as I should have been. For CS, there was what they called not as much of an X factor with me, and we can talk about that in a second. With
Mm.
Jeffries, there was just a really poor cultural fit there. So there was always a reason, and I think I stepped back from that and said, okay, so I haven't got anything for summer yet. I'm going into the process, having to apply for all 20, 25 banks essentially. And what I realized was the importance of peaking at the right time. I think it was really crucial for me not to view a lot of those winter failures as failures, but almost as practice, funnily enough, because deep
Mm.
down I knew that I probably didn't want to end up at a lot of those various places. And I think they knew that as well. And it sort of happened for a good reason, in that it forced me to ultimately say, okay, here are the banks I actually want to be at. Let me show really clearly through my CV, cover letter, behaviorals why I want to be there. And then by the time summers had rolled around, I knew to myself that I could not have done any more work for those summer
Mm.
internship roles, and it ended up working quite well. So those were definitely failures, no doubt. And I say this to a lot of students who are currently going through the process as well. But I sort of had the hindsight to say probably didn't prepare as well enough at the time. There were really good things to work on, and I really asked for feedback after each one of those failures as well, because I knew that it wasn't really important for me to peak in winter. It was important for me to peak in summer because that's where
Mm.
my future graduate role was going to come from.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's really interesting to hear this sort of thing. So I'm interested to ask, when you say like, preparing for some of these roles, and you mentioned some things there about like, perhaps you can touch on like the X factor, you
Mhm.
know, or like, not knowing certain things as well as you would have liked. What does it kind of look like to prepare for some of these things? Like, what sort of like, what are you even looking at when you're like, yeah, what is, I guess, I guess, what does like preparation look like when you're applying, interested in applying for these kinds of things?
Yeah, sure. So if I take it back, sort of macro level. Let's say you're applying for 20 jobs, which is what I was doing. So I was applying, I didn't have a summer gig, so I was applying to all the banks essentially, which is about 20.
Mm,
Um, so I had a massive Excel spreadsheet with sort of a bank on each row, and then each column was a different part of the application process. So it would be, the date it's due, cover letters submitted, video submission, psychometrics, and then first round, second round, so on and so forth. And then I had a column essentially of people I knew at the bank, and people who I wanted to reach out to, as well. And I feel like that really grounded me in terms of, okay, here's all the work I need to do in order to potentially get
mm,
one job out of this process. And I think it's really important in these processes not to leave anything to your mind. Make sure as much of it is down on the page so that you don't have to remember, okay, did I apply for Jarden? Have I done the psychometrics for Credit Suisse, so on and so forth. So that was my big planning regime, first and foremost. And
mm,
then the next stage from there, perhaps we'll touch on sort of the CV cover letter side of things, in
mm,
terms of crafting those. So I think the cover letter, is the big chance for people to differentiate themselves. I think people underestimate the fact that whilst your recruiting manager may not read it, your interviewer often does. And it got brought up quite a few times in my interview. And I had a really simple structure, to go through these. You sort of get bookmarked by your intro and your conclusion. But there are
mm,
three key questions to answer in every cover letter. The first one is why this company, the second one is why this industry, and then the third one is why you. And if you can answer all three of those questions to some degree of specificity and sort of, passion, then you automatically put yourself in the top like 1 to 5% of applicants. So
mm,
in terms of why this company, that's the paragraph that changes for each cover letter. So even if you're doing 20 cover letters, 80% of that cover letter stays the same. It's just that one paragraph that changes. And
mm,
for that why this company paragraph, I really had three key reasons that I'd always try to bring out. I think three is a nice round number,
yeah.
um, and I always made sure my last reason was something related to being at the company for a long time or creating a long-term career out of it. So, take McKinsey for example. McKinsey have this program called the Fellowship Program, where essentially after your first 2 years, you can go away and do a sponsored MBA or do an internship at a, client company or so on and so forth. And I
Mm,
explicitly said, pretty much quote unquote, I would really see myself building a long term career at McKinsey. And whether you believe that or not, those are the things that are what a lot of these corporates, banks, consulting firms are looking to, because churn is quite high in these industries, and therefore knowing that they can lock down people potentially for 5, 10 years is pretty important.
mm,
And then this why this company, question also comes back to the research you do on the company, and it needs to be super specific. So 80% of candidates will look on the website. They might cite the mission of the company, which is still a lot more than a lot of candidates do. But
mm,
finding a really specific reason why you want to work at that company is super important, because everyone is very aware of the fact that everyone is applying everywhere. So,
Mm.
specific examples are things like, at Macquarie, I talked a lot about the head office advantage. So, Macquarie Bank's head office is in Sydney. Compare that to a lot of the US banks, Goldman, JPM, Morgan Stanley. Their head offices are overseas, or if it's APAC, they're often in Singapore, Hong Kong. So there's a lot more red tape involved in sort of getting decisions done. And if you, as a potential intern, can highlight that, that's pretty impressive to a lot of the seniors who don't think that research could have come out.
Mm.
So I'd say, you know, that's really the crux of the cover letter. As to sort of the widest industry and sector and the why you're really just linking it back to your personal experience and your skills. And you mentioned the X factor feedback. After my Credit Suisse interview, I essentially asked, why didn't I get a role? And the response was, you've done all these incredible things, which they were referencing being a leader in the FMAA Society, 180 Degree Consulting, Army Cadets, so on and so forth. But they felt I didn't have this quote unquote X factor. And what I realized was my X factor was having done all these vastly disparate things, but linking them all together somehow in a way that painted me as a super well rounded person. So that
Mm.
just sort of shaped the way I um, ended up approaching the interviews and the process as well. So that's sort of the cover letter, and then the CV is very similar, I would say. Obviously, you want your CV not to um, overlap too much of your cover letter, but I think firstly keep it to a page. Like if a CEO can keep it to a page, so can you. And I think
Mm.
there's like, yes, the CEO obviously has a lot of brand equity. They don't need to put out all their achievements, but I got the comment numerous times. Oh wow, a one-page CV. This is really nice to see. So clearly, it's something that it's noticed on. And then in terms of like the key segments, obviously education, professional experience, leadership and extracurriculars, and then the skills and interest component. I think the two big pieces of advice I'd give here are one, quantify everything. And this is particularly the case for consulting and banking interviews. Like if it's a banking interview and a banking CV, obviously anonymize things that can't be public, but say things like, we advised a X billion dollar company on the acquisition of a X million dollar asset. Show them that you have a knowledge of size and numbers. Talk if you've screened companies. Don't just say screened, companies across the e-commerce sector in APAC. Say, personally screened 50 companies or 100, whatever it was. I think it's really
Mm.
important to show that. And then the second piece of advice is what's your personal impact? And I think that's where so many people fall down on is that teamwork questions aren't about the team. They're actually about you and how you work in the team. So you need to focus a lot on what your specific role is. And sometimes that can be really hard. Like if you're a junior in an intern bank or a boutique bank, it can be hard to sort of overstate or properly state the role you've played. But I think it gets pretty easy as a banker or consultant to see where a potential candidate is sort of fibbing and not saying exactly what their role was. And then the final piece of advice I'd have for the CV, and I might stop there after this, is that final line of your CV, which is probably going to be an interest line, is the most important line in your entire CV because that's the differentiator between you and all the other candidates, and it's the opportunity to essentially shine. And I think a lot of candidates get told to keep it pretty tame, and obviously don't put an interest in there that is obviously not kosher. But as an example, I'm heavily interested in the science of longevity and aging and the work of David Sinclair and Peter Attia and all these incredible people. And the last word on my CV is longevity because it's the last interest on my interest section. And in
Mm.
my final round McKinsey interview, we spent 15 minutes talking with the managing partner about senescent cells and zombie cells and fasting and the impacts on organisms. And this was a final round management consulting interview. So my point
Mm.
being is that you never know when these things will come up, and that interest line is probably the finest line of all.
Yeah. Wow, that is really cool. I think that's worth like taking notes and writing some of that down because yeah, I think that's super valuable, and I absolutely agree with a lot of that. I think like particularly, the quantifying like or using quantities or whatever in your resume is super important. And then saying like outcomes rather than things you actually did. So like, or even if it's like I did this thing which had this outcome, that's super important too, rather than just being like I did this. Like, okay, cool, but
Mm.
yeah,
And you'll
what
get
like,
asked that in your interview as well anyway. So if you
mm,
can preempt that early on, it always helps.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm curious then. So all this stuff, kind of applying for these, what um, what did you do more of? Going from sort of the winters to preparing for summer. Is there anything that like you said you did slightly more in preparing for summer. Like, what sort of things did you do more of to kind of clear up, some of the things that you maybe didn't do as much of in winter?
Sure. I think so the CV and cover letter, all of that fell off pretty quickly. Like once you get those in check, there's only so much you can do, and once you've hit that cap, send it to 20, 30 different people as I did, get that
Mm,
feedback, and then you're done. I submitted those applications pretty quickly. I think the big difference between winter and summer was essentially sounds cringe, but priming yourself for interview performance, I think.
mm,
And in the same way that you wouldn't rock up to the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics without a whole lifetime's worth of running that sprint a billion times, um, practicing interviews, especially when I did it, which was the age of virtual interviews, practicing interviews was super duper important. So let me take
mm,
banking for example. So banking interviews, there are really four key buckets, and I think more broadly, actually, there are four key buckets of questions you get asked. The
mm,
first bucket is technicals. The second bucket is behavioral questions. So how do you work in a team? The
mm,
third bucket is general knowledge. So how much do you know about the world around you? And the fourth
mm,
bucket is sort of company specific. Why do you want to work at this company? Do you know what type of work we do, and those sort of things.
mm,
Um, so if I keep it specific to banking, you know, technicals, everybody knows there's this mergers and inquisitions 400 question book that everybody has. So
mm,
I use that book, as well as after each interview I had during winter, I immediately, I'd go to a bathroom, I'd go to the lift or somewhere where I would be quiet, and straight away I'd write down all the questions I got in that interview.
mm,
I never left it to memory to sort of go home and remember. I sort of immediately wanted to get them down.
mm,
And after that, I had a repository of what, maybe 50 questions or so, which were to me were far more valuable than whatever's in that M&I 400 book, because these were questions that were being asked. And by the time I got
mm,
to summer, a lot of those questions were coming up again. So I made sure I practiced those, and in a sense, winter essentially was practice for the summer.
mm,
Um, and I did the same thing for behaviorals as well. What I essentially did was have a big document where I had all the questions listed out. I'd write a little paragraph for each question. And then I bought myself sort of a 200 pack of palm cards. And this would have been about 3 weeks before the interviews. And anyone who's going through the banking interview process knows that the banking interviews are all over within 3 days. So it's a very sort of concentrated time period.
mm,
So I had sort of 200 palm cards. On one side of the palm card, I'd write the question. On the other side of the palm card, I'd write a dot pointed version of the answer. And I essentially stood in front of my mirror for a week, and then just recited those over and over again. Obviously not 24/7, but
mm,
an hour or so each night.
mm,
To the point where I was comfortable enough that I knew the answer and I understood the logic behind it, but not so confident that it was sounding robotic and like I just memorized something. And you need to
mm,
find the balance. And I think this is where a lot of candidates fall down, is that they're either underprepared, by meaning they don't know their content, or they're not aware of their various star methods for various behavioral questions, or they've prepared to the extreme where they've either memorized something and they just say it verbatim,
mm,
or they hear a question, hear that it's similar to a question they've practiced, and then just answer the question they've practiced rather than answering the question they get given. And
mm,
you don't want to be on either parts of those extremes. You want to be somewhere in the middle. So practicing technicals and behaviorals in that manner was really useful for me. And then the final two buckets around general knowledge and company specific things. I think firstly on the general knowledge point, for banking, it's pretty common knowledge that you will get asked tell me about a deal in the market, and or tell me about a deal that we've advised on. And I chose sort of three or four deals that covered off I think probably four banks that I ended up applying to in the end.
mm,
I just knew as much as I could about those deals. What the top sort of echelon of candidates do is that they provide a view on the deal and they provide a view on what's happening in the market. And that's something that people don't do enough of, because ultimately you're being hired as an intern or a graduate analyst, not just to sit in the back of rooms and take meeting notes, but also to
Mm.
actively contribute and show that you have a view on what's happening in the world. And if you can show that, at an intern level or interviewing for an internship role level,
Mm.
that becomes infinitely valuable. And then the last part around company specific, I think, probably two buckets to this. Firstly, rehashing the similar why McKinsey, why Goldman, whatever you've written in your cover letter and CV and so forth, but not CV, but cover letter.
Mm.
But more specifically, once you find out who your interviewers are, if you're lucky enough to do so, do your own due diligence on them. So, you know, people might think it's stalking, whatever it is, but go on their LinkedIn, see what the news coverage has been like. What are their interests? What are their passions? Which deals have they worked on quite recently? Not so much for the banking interviews, but for the consulting interviews, often a lot of your interviewers will have written articles and thought pieces on the company website. So,
Mm.
especially in a consulting context where normally the cases you get given are problems that your interviewers have actually already done in real life, you can get a pretty quick idea of what your problem is going to be based on, oh wow, Emily, my interviewer, did a banking transformation in Southeast Asia. Okay, it might be something to do with banking. And that's sort of this is, 2, 3 days before your interview. That's the sort of prep you want to be doing so that you're tailoring whatever you're saying for the interviewer.
Mm. Yeah, that's super interesting, and thanks so much for sharing that because I think that's even I'm finding that valuable, and I'm not gonna. Yeah, I'm not a grad anymore, so but I think that's super cool, and I think that's advice that like you can apply, no matter where it is that you're sort of going for.
Totally.
This level of depth and kind of the approach to cover letters and things like that is pretty universal, regardless of the industry or whatever. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that because I think that's really useful.
Absolutely, and like even before I met you, sort of a month and a bit ago,
Mm.
the 1 minute you spend finding out a person's background makes the conversation infinitely more enjoyable. So that's a common piece of advice, regardless of whether you're applying for a job or not.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I want to ask too around like the networking side of this, because like you mentioned when you had your Excel spreadsheet and you had sort of this job, this is like the data stew, like and all these different columns, and then one of them there was like, who do I know that works here? I'm curious to understand, like, was there any like how do you go about sort of connecting with people that work in these places, and then sort of what is the I guess how do you go about like involving them in your process to like when you're applying for this
Mhm.
kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think network is a bit of a dirty word. At least it sort of has that connotation, right?
Mm.
The word networking is seen as transactional in many cases, and yes, I think it is transactional, but that's what I think the difference is between networking and relationship building. And for me, especially for graduate students, I think it's super important to separate the role of networking into two different values. Firstly, you have informational value, and then secondly, you have outcome value. Informational value is unlimited, it's untapped. There is never too much information that you can get from an individual or a group of individuals. Outcome
Mm.
value is capped. Once you get a particular role, that's your outcome finished, you've ticked the box. And if you start thinking about network building and relationship building from an information value perspective, that's going to make those relationships much more valuable to you, but it's also going to mean people are much more likely to buy into helping you out as well. And those are two big things I think I realize is firstly, people like to help other people generally. And if they don't like to help other people, that's a good signal of the culture of the place and the individual.
Mm.
And then secondly, people very easily get invested in other people's success. And once you can get those connections going, it does help you out quite a bit. So in terms of how I actually approached networking, so as you said, when this probably would have been around January of the year, and applications were in July. So big runway, and I think
Mm.
that's quite important as well. But in January, February, around that period of time, I looked on my LinkedIn, went onto each bank, and saw who were my first degree connections. And most of those people were either peers who had actually just started as graduates, or people who
Mm-hmm.
are in similar societies as me, and were therefore obviously first degree connections as well. So I pretty quickly could have a list of maybe two or three, maybe five people per bank who I sort of knew. And in the first instance, I made sure to reach out to all of those individuals. Um, a lot of them I knew pretty well anyway, so it wasn't really a hey, I'm meeting with you
Mm.
only to like. It was also just a friendly connection anyway. Um,
Yeah.
but that was sort of the first step. And then after that, I think the big mistake people make is they look at networking as a numbers game. It is not a
Mm.
numbers game. I remember there's a student I mentor in the year below who told me, oh, Cheran, one of my mates was talking about the fact that I need like 100 minimum connections. And absolutely not the case. Once you get into the interviews, the network, unless you somehow know the managing partner or managing director of a company, is rather, abysmal in terms of your chances. What networking does is it's firstly a safety net in terms of it makes sure that you aren't left within the cracks between, say, submitting an application and getting a video interview or getting an interview. Um, but to me, the network gave me informational value. So it allowed me to say really unique things that people wouldn't know because McKinsey, for example, aren't going to be advertising the day-to-day life of a consultant, both the good and the bad, on the front page of a website. Whereas I can
Mm.
talk to a current third-year consultant, for example, or an investment banking analyst at Macquarie, for example, understand what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis. What are the new things that are coming out? That was where the value was. And that boosted my interview chances because I was saying things that made me sound like I was already a graduate at McKinsey,
Mm.
Goldman, Macquarie, wherever it was. So I
Mm.
think that comes down to, after you've done your first degree list, think about whether you really need to talk to more people. And if you do need to talk to more people, firstly, don't be sort of coy about it. Feel fine to go talk to a hiring manager and say, hey, I don't know anybody at the firm currently. I would love if you can connect me with X. And that's exactly what I did for McKinsey. I was lucky enough that one of the McKinsey hiring managers also hired me at Macquarie. But I didn't know
Mm.
any consultants at McKinsey prior to applying. So I just said, hey, Margarita, I don't know anyone at the firm. Could you I get connected to one individual? Him and I had a
Mm.
great chat. He was like, without me even asking, he was like, Sharon,
Mm.
I've got a really good mate. I want you to speak to him as well. And that snowball keeps going until you've met, you know, 5, 10 people. But
Mm.
each incremental connection after that needs to come from a place of, okay, we have this common background interest, or there's a really specific reason why I want to talk to you as opposed to the other 30 grads I could have talked to. And that might
Mm.
be because they work in a particular team. They may come from a similar socioeconomic, LGBTQI, racial, whatever background it is. But showing that common interest is what really helps you get your network going from there. Um, and ultimately, now that I'm at the end of my grad process and everything's done, I don't think about outcome value anymore. And I'm very privileged in the sense that I had a positive outcome as to where I've ended up. But
Mm.
all of the people I've met are informational value people because even people, say at the Boston Consulting Group, where I ended up not going, a lot of the people I've met there are still very happy to grab coffee with me and so on and so forth to help me as I
Mm.
leave university.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And can you speak to like the importance of, because I think like you said, a lot of the first degree connections that you had in different places you met like either at university or maybe through other people or whatever. So how important do you think, uh, or maybe what is the value of like university clubs? At university, is there value in the actual participation, or is it more of like a just a great way to sort of connect with people that are on a similar journey to yourself.
I think it's a bit of both. I think without a doubt, the biggest value is the people you meet and the connections you make. Now, they may be your best friend, they may become your partner, they may, just be a person you work with in the future. But of course, joining the local, business society, or I'll plug the Financial Management Association of Australia or 180 Degrees Consulting. All of those are good ways just to meet a bunch of different people in your own year group. Now, being part of the actual committees is probably where you then often get the next step of meeting people in years above who have also been through what you've recently been through and things like that. But a lot of these clubs and societies do mentorship programs where they connect you with people who are either 1 to 2 years older in university or have recently graduated. And for me, it was invaluable. I would not be anywhere close to where I am now without having joined, the FNAA or 180 degrees. Not because those were things on my CV, but because I knew people who could help me out when the time was right and could give me advice. So to me, those connections are invaluable. And the incremental step up in terms of taking responsibility, I don't think that's a networking thing anymore. I think that's more just, you're building your own teamwork skills, and of course, it gives you substance to talk about those behavioral questions in interviews.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting to hear. And yeah, I was in 180 in my final year of university, and certainly I agree that like the kinds of people that I met there, really super interesting people, and have gone on to do like really cool things. And so it's great to sort of build your relationships, in that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. What do you think are some of the areas like of the application process that people kind of underestimate the difficulty of, or like common areas that people like kind of get tripped up? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's probably a few things. I think the big one is underestimating the time it takes to perform at each stage of the application process to your peak. Now, what do I mean by that? Um, let's say applications, as they do for investment banking, and I'm probably going to scare a lot of people who are listening who are applying at the moment, but let's say they close in the first week of August. In reality, to have a chance, you need to get your application in minimum 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks prior, I'd say. Um, if it was me, I'd be getting it 3 weeks prior. So let's say you do get it in 3 weeks prior. That means you have 3 weeks between when you click submit and when you click your interview slot, if you're lucky enough to get one,
Mm.
to do your psychometrics, do your video interview, and start preparing for interviews without the knowledge of whether you're going to get an interview or not. Now, if you think you can do that for 20 banks in 3 weeks and perform at your peak for each of those processes, then I want to meet you because you're Superman or Superwoman. So that was the big learning for me, is that the psychometrics I failed and the video interviews I failed were because I rushed them and I didn't give them the appropriate time of day and night to take the steps to actually do the preparation required. And I think the
Mm.
preparation I do is probably a bit extreme for some things. For the psychometric tests, I'll go find out what the providing company was. Normally it's Korn Ferry, sometimes it's other ones. And I'd go spend an hour watching YouTube videos of other people solving, the games, and going on Reddit and figuring out what trips other people up and doing all the practice tests and then treating it like an actual exam, because people don't realize how competitive these processes are. And the hurdle rate for surpassing a lot of these tests is so high that people almost take it for granted. And then before you know it, oh, I've lost out at the psychometric stage. And I've been on the wrong end of that numerous times. And those were the failures that it took for me to realize to actually take those seriously. So I think that would be the first thing I'd say people sort of fall down on. The other thing I would say um, is when you get to the interview stage, um, there is a tendency to show that you are the best candidate for right now. Um, and the hard reality is that companies don't care about right now. They care about 12 months' time, 24 months' time, 72 months' time. They're priming themselves to pick a cohort of people who will peak in the future, not right now. And that means that it's okay to say things like, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure. I made this mistake in this period of time. Admitting and showing weakness is so crucially important to success in these interviews, because it first shows coachability in the sense that obviously most of the jobs that we're talking about are team related jobs, and therefore they want students who can show an ability to listen to people who've had more experience. But secondly, as I said, that they're picking people who are going to peak and who have potential. And once you get that into your head, it becomes a humbling experience, but it also makes sure you don't fall into the trap of being too cocky or too boasty, which
Mm,
is where I think a lot of students fall away from, because they have all this knowledge in their head, they have all these experiences they've done, and they're bursting to show what it means, and that sometimes comes off the wrong way.
mm. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. What? Like you're just a gold mine of information. So I don't really have much to offer. I'm just interested just to keep asking you stuff.
Obviously, you apply for a whole bunch of stuff tomorrow.
Yeah. That's it. Wow. So now you're at like kind of a lot of this sort of a lot of time spent applying and all this kind of stuff is now in the past for you, at least in the immediate term. So I wonder what has been the biggest learning for yourself over the last, I guess, what maybe a year to 18 months, kind of as you've gone through this journey.
Good question. I think the biggest learning is to care less about, and I'm so conscious of the privilege in this statement, um, but to care less about the outcome, and to care more about the journey and the incremental task. That's way more important than some job that you're going to get in 12, 18 months' time. And I think I struggled, I was deeply unhappy at various points of university because I thought I wasn't keeping up on the hedonic treadmill of internships that other students were. And I already know I can hear my own mates screaming at me listening to this saying, we all wish we were on your level of hedonic treadmill as well, but there's always someone who's further ahead, right? And
Mm,
I think that can eat away at you a lot if you aren't careful with it. So that would be my biggest learning, and we might end up talking about how I've gone from banking to consulting in the end. But that last experience is probably the one that's taught me that the most. I think the other thing is being self-aware enough to know that luck is a huge, huge factor in these processes, both on the upside and the downside. Now, that doesn't mean I can't say, I deserve or I worked hard enough to get X, Y, Z. Um, but that isn't a mutually exclusive statement from I was lucky to some extent to not have been screened out, to have shown that I can do, whatever it is. And you want to put yourself in that position where you recognize that luck is a factor. Um, and recognizing that is a factor, you can sleep at night knowing that there's nothing else you could have done to have influenced the outcome. And if that's the stage you're at, then that's all you can do. But if you're at a stage where you're almost having to blame luck because of an unfortunate outcome, you don't want to be at that stage, because that's where regret starts eating away. And there's one bank that I was interested in, and it didn't go through, but I knew I could not have done anything else I wanted to do, and I knew the perception from that interviewer that day, was the reason why, and that's perfectly okay. I'm at peace with that. So if you can find peace in that journey, I think it helps you a lot.
mm. Yeah, definitely. I think that's really cool. I guess like sometimes, like when perhaps you get a disappointing outcome or things like that, people can kind of blame the downside on
Hmm.
luck, but the upside is because they worked hard.
Always happens.
And
Always
so
happens. Yep.
so it's like I got this job because I worked hard and I didn't get it because the
I was
recruitment
unlucky.
process
Yep.
didn't. Yeah, I was
Yep.
unlucky, right? And so this, yeah. So but I think that's a great point that like taking ownership of like what you did and kind of the outcomes that you're expected, and then kind of letting go of whatever happens after that. What will be, and yeah, I think yeah, certainly it can be difficult to approach things like that, right?
It
And I
can be
think
hugely difficult. Yeah,
yeah.
and I think after having a string of failures over winter last year, I have this whiteboard in front of me which is sort of falling by the wayside at the moment. But I wrote up on the top. I can't remember who said this quote, but be so good they can't ignore you, essentially. And that was a mentality I've taken throughout a lot of life. Is be good enough, don't make excuses, work as hard as you know you can work, and anything else that happens is outside of your control. And that's all you really need, to sleep well at night. Plus, a loving family, a loving friends, and all those sort of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important. We've spoken about kind of the failures, kind of the things you hope to go well, I guess, with regard to sort of the winters and things like that. But what has been like something that didn't go to plan along this whole journey that ended up being something that was really beneficial for you in the end? Is there any like maybe perhaps it's the winters situation there, or I'm curious if there was perhaps another situation along the way that ended up, was a something you were like frustrated by at the time, but ended up being something that turned out really well.
Yeah, totally. Um, I'm really happy talking about this one because I don't think when I was going through this process, I didn't know anyone else who had been through the same. So, I was at Macquarie Capital over summer. Um, Loved the experience there over in the TMET is what they call it, the TMET team, so the technology, media, entertainment, telecommunications team. Really loved the culture and the team, and I was pretty set on going back to Macquarie most likely afterwards. And I remember it was a Wednesday evening around 5 p.m. This is after the internship had finished a week after, and I was doing my McKinsey application actually at the time. I was doing my cover letter for McKinsey, and I got a call from HR, and HR essentially said, "Look, really sorry, but we aren't going to be offering you a graduate position at this stage." And I had sort of felt that in my gut for a few days because I think I, for some reason, could just feel that was coming. But that was a pretty big shock to me, a really big disappointment. And obviously the sort of the freakiness, nervousness nature kicked in straight away. What am I going to do now? I'm not going to have a job as a grad job coming back. Exchanges off the cards now. There's no way I can be overseas doing all these
Mm.
things. And um, it took me a while to sort of step back for a moment and say, okay, so I haven't got a graduate job now. I'm in the middle of consulting processes. I have an option to apply for banking grads in a few weeks' time. And I sort of sent one of my friends, Blake Im, who you'll know as well from
Mm.
Next Chapter. I sent him a message and I said, FYI, I'm going all in on these consulting processes. Let's see what happens. And I'd seriously considered consulting, but had always sort of thought I had a preference for banking, having worked there for a year and a bit. But ultimately, with about 2 weeks left, went all in on the consulting firms. A month later, had a few offers, luckily enough, and sort of took my time after that to really consider: did I actually want to go to banking? Was this rose tinted glasses per se? I did my diligence. I spent about 6 weeks, and we can talk about this as well in terms of post interview decision making. But spent
Mm.
6 weeks talking to bankers, consultants, a whole bunch of people saying this is where I want to be in 5, 10 years time, which is either on the investing side of things at a VC or as an operator, and what's going to be the best way for me to get there. And after a lot of conversations, was pretty confident that consulting was the way to go, and I ended up not applying to banking again for the graduate roles. So I was always going to apply to McKinsey, BCG, Bain, regardless of Macquarie. But I think the failure with Macquarie gave me a big kick up the guts, I think, to recognize number one, um, you know, I didn't agree with all of the reasons and outcomes that they gave me, but I learned a lot about, the need for over communication, balancing numerous demands, working from home, saying no. Like there was a lot of valuable feedback I took away from the team. Um, but I think the other thing is that we don't talk about failure enough, and I think when I got that initial call, I called my buddy and I asked her, and she straight away said, "Cheran, there are people at Goldman, at Morgan Stanley, at other banks who have also been through the exact same thing, but no one ever talks about it because they just don't really want to." And I think that's a shame. The failures don't matter as long as they're manageable failures. And Ray Dalio always talks about sort of the idea of micro failures and macro wins. And for me, this was a micro failure. Like, okay, I didn't get my graduate job at Macquarie, but I might be looking back in 5 years' time, talking about this as a macro win, essentially, a completely different path that might set me up better. So,
Mm.
um, look, it's hard to put a positive spin on failure sometimes, but a big learning curve for me, and everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, no, you're spot on there. I think Yeah, well, I totally agree with what you said. I think it's often, especially with these kinds of things, you look out and it seems like everyone's just had like the perfect journey. Nothing went wrong. They just like sailed through and everything went exactly to plan. When like it almost always is not the case. I
Absolutely.
think, yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
you go on LinkedIn and you just see a progression of one thing to the next to the next. But I think if we all restructured our LinkedIns to say, okay, you got this job and then failed at five others in between and then got this job, I think everyone would
Mm.
be feeling a little bit better about themselves. So it's about high time that we just made that a bit more public.
Yeah, I've seen. I don't know if you've seen this idea, but there's this idea of like an anti resume where like
Yes.
you
Yeah.
have like all the places you didn't get into, and that's like your separate thing.
Yeah, I mean,
That's quite cool.
Bessemer Venture Partners, who are one of the big SaaS VCs in the US, have an anti-portfolio where they essentially have on their page a list of companies that they didn't invest in or that they passed on.
Mm,
And I think some of them are, you know, I think a lot of other VCs have tried to do a similar thing, but it reflects the same sentiment, right? Let's be more open about this. Let's talk about those failures. Because in reality, it's not all the way up into the right curve.
mm,
Much like the markets, it's up one day, down the next. So, it's good
yeah.
to make that more known.
Yeah, no, you're spot on there, and yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story because certainly it's when you've worked so hard for something, it's hard to kind of face that. But I think, like you said, you overcame it really well, and it's ended up working potentially better than than going down the original path. So
Yeah, we'll,
so
we'll
that's really
find out
good.
in a few years' time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd love to sort of talk about you were talking there about like the post interview decision process and kind of what you went through there, speaking to heaps of people to try and work out like what does this look like for me. I think one thing I want to mention is I think it's really great that you have like this is where I want to be in 10 years, right? Because I think even myself to some extent and many people out there don't have that, and so it's hard then to sort of filter which opportunities that are good and which maybe is if you get offered something, should you say yes or no? Like having that as a filter, a way to decide things is really cool. But so I just want to mention that. I'm sure like you can mention it as well. But yeah, I'd love to sort of dive into this process here of like what you did once you had some of the offers
Mhm.
available.
Yeah, and I'll just, building off what you just mentioned, I'll just qualify it to say it's good to have a plan, but it should never be, in stone. I was
Mm,
fairly set I was going to end up in investment banking, and look what's happened there. So, in the same way that I was fairly certain I would end up in law and fairly certain I would end up in politics. So, these things all need to be sort of movable and flexible. I think,
mm,
for me, the post interview decision making process, I have no doubt in my mind that I was probably one of the last people to sign the McKinsey contract, and I took a long time. Like I think 7 weeks in the end, and I think candidates should feel absolutely no pressure to sign within deadlines. Now I know investment banking is a bit different sometimes. They give you a week and that's it, but Naval Ravikant, very famous angel investor, founder of AngelList, talks about three big decisions in your 20s, where you'll live, who you'll be with, and what your job is. And you should take your time on all three of those decisions. So, in terms of my actual process, um, the first thing I did was I sat down and I thought about what mattered to me from sort of a rubric, sense, and try to rank those. So it might be things like pay, prestige, exit opportunities, opportunity to work overseas, learning and development, training, any factor that you think is relevant. Um,
mm,
and what you want to do is figure out, what matters to you and what doesn't matter to you. And I think the big, for me, and there's massive privilege that I acknowledge in saying this. For me, pay was the bottom of the list. So, um, you know, yes, a massive pay cut. And one of the big things that people would always say, funnily enough, bankers a lot of the time,
mm,
moving from banking to consulting is, oh, you're working similar hours for half the pay. And I was like, yeah, I am. But if I'm going to have a material step change in wealth, it's not going to be because I've earned an extra $300,000 in my first 2 years. It's going to be because, I've met a certain person or done a certain business that's resulted in a massive step change in 10, 20 years' time. So I think about the factors that matter to you, and I think it's just really important for people to remember. We talk about it when it comes to working out or otherwise, but short-term pain, long-term gain is a big thing, and I think we undervalue the effect of compounding a lot, and that's why a short-term cash stipend or the opportunity to go overseas immediately versus training networks development over 5 years, you have to discount those back, whether you're a discounted cash flow person or not. You have to discount those back to some present value and understand what that value means to you. So that was the first stage. The second stage then was, leverage your success, like talk to as many different people as possible. I probably ended up talking to about 50 consultants across
Mm,
McKinsey and BCG. And you know, I sort of had three buckets of people I wanted to talk to. And this is how I phrased it when I asked for connections. I said, number one, I want to talk to people who had received offers from both firms and had chosen one or the other. Two, I wanted to talk to people who had come from investment banking or previously been in banking, or considered banking and come to consulting. And then the third bucket was I wanted to talk to people who had left the firm. So like alumni essentially.
mm,
And I was like, both firms were and consultants were happy to connect me with all those people. And after a while, you hear very similar things. You take everything with a grain of salt because obviously everyone has a vested interest in bringing you towards their company. Um,
mm,
but I had like a 30-page document by the end of the 6 weeks with all the notes I had taken from all those people. I sat down one Sunday afternoon. I already pretty much knew my decision, but I sort of went through all of those notes, linked them back to my various decision factors, and ticked the box between the two firms, and it came out pretty overwhelmingly clear. So um, that was my decision making process. It is a very consultancy process in terms of breaking it down. Completely aware of that. But I think for me it was really structured, and um, it links back to, I think this is something I've started only in the last maybe 9 months or so, but the idea of a decision journal I think is so important because um, whenever you're, say I'm at McKinsey in 12 months or 18 months time, and I'm going through a rough patch and I'm questioning why I'm there, I can go back to that decision frame, notes that I took and say, these were the reasons I chose this job. Is that still true? If it isn't true, why am I still here? And then make that
mm,
decision again. And it's so important to have a decision journal for every decision in life, whether that's, if it's who you want to date or what restaurant you want to go to or whatever it is. But ideally, it's the bigger decisions in your life. But um, I think for me, it was really important just to have that not bolted down. So, that would be my structured process. But at least talking from a consulting perspective, take your time, and don't be afraid to ask, because companies who want you, and they will if you've got an offer, they will be happy generally to connect you to the people you want to speak with.
mm. Yeah, that's really cool. I think, yeah, it's really interesting to hear how you approach it, and certainly like, yeah, having those criteria. I know I've done that for big decisions that I've made, like going on exchange. I did that where I was like, what are the pros and cons of this, and then like, and I think
Cons,
that's a
empty bank account.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Literally, that was the only con. Basically, like you have no money left. You get to see the world, all this fun stuff. Like, okay, I'm young, like it makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I agree. I think, and being able to sort of tie it to perhaps a medium long term vision of like
Mhm,
what you want your life to look like as well. I think having that criteria sort of somewhere in there is a great way to evaluate important decisions like this.
mhm.
Whether like your first sort of job out of university. I think, yeah, I think that's really cool.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
One thing I want to ask is like sort of what questions would you ask people in this process? Like you're meeting with other consultants
Mm,
that currently work or have recently left. Are there any, yeah, what kind of themes, what are you trying to ask, and
mhm.
perhaps like were there any good questions that you asked them to kind of learn more about the company? And because I'm thinking as well, you could probably ask similar ones through the recruiting process as well,
Totally.
right? Where you're trying to learn about the company and the culture and the
Mhm,
opportunities and all that kind of stuff.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to like when it came to post decision making, obviously a lot of the questions and a lot of these consultants had already been debriefed. So they were like, okay, Cheran is considering between McKinsey and X. You need to convince him to come to X, and like that's sort of
Mm-hmm.
the flow of the conversation. And but that being
Mm,
said, the questions are still quite similar even before I had got offers. So a lot of the questions are, why have you come to X? I saw you've done X previously. What was the framework around that? Why did you leave that job? Why are you still here? But I think the value for your listeners probably comes from some of the niche questions to ask, and I had a few that I always asked, probably for those conversations after offers. The first one I always asked was just what were the decision factors that you were thinking about when you made your decision. And 90% of the time they aligned with the same things I was thinking about. So training and development, offshore, pay if it was a material factor or not. But every now and then there would be one consultant who'd say some factor that I hadn't thought of at all, and often it would be a very niche industry that they were interested in, for example, or McKinsey have just started their McKinsey Health Institute, and there was one consultant who had come specifically for that. So all those sort of things as well.
mm,
Um, the question I always asked every person was, what are, and actually this was a question I asked during the interview as well, which I think was quite effective. Um, was what are the characteristics of the best business analysts, which is the entry level position at McKinsey? What are the
mm,
best characteristics of the business analysts at McKinsey, or the associates at BCG, or the investment banking analysts at Macquarie or Goldman or wherever? Um, and what that question shows is that firstly, you're wanting to be the best, but secondly, that you're thinking like two steps beyond what you're actually applying for, because you're not just
mm,
asking about your internship. You're asking about, I want to be an investment banking analyst at Macquarie Group. What are the best things, or what are the characteristics that I could develop now to prepare me for that in 18 months' time?
mm.
And I think most of the times that question got followed with about 15 seconds of silence because no one had ever asked them that before. And then they sort of thought, okay, well, yeah, this is one like junior in my team who I think he's really great, and these are the things that he does.
Mm,
And that was a really nice way to get that conversation going. So those would be a lot of the questions I would ask, and then the rest are just riffs on personal life. And
mm.
I'm a big Formula One fan, and there was there's actually two consultants at McKinsey. One's ex Red Bull, one's ex Ferrari. So we could just talk
Yeah,
about
cool.
that for ages as well.
Nice, man. No, that's super cool. And yeah, I think like asking the right questions is so important. And I think a question like that is great because yeah, like you said, it shows you're interested. You know, them answering it gives you feedback around the sort of things that perhaps you could like turn it around and give them an example of like
Mhm.
a time where you exercise those traits. Perhaps if you're somewhere in the interview. So yeah, I think
Totally.
that's yeah, I think that's super cool. Um, I want to ask, perhaps we're getting to the end, so maybe we've got two more like things that I just like to ask you, and one is like, what I'm interested just because like like you're a high performing person, right?
I appreciate that,
you yeah
Jack.
you yeah. So you do a lot of things really well, like and so I'm interested to know kind of what like what drives you like on a daily basis, like what like why do you go out and achieve, like is there are there any like sort of reasons that you can put to that, is it, or yeah, how do you think about that?
It's a really good question. I think if I'm being completely real, it's a fear of mediocrity. I think that's something that a lot of people can probably attune with. But it comes from a place. My parents both came from Sri Lanka during a not so great time in the world, and fairly
Mm,
middle class. I see how hard they work. There's part of me that's like, well, you better ace this life because
yeah.
there's only one chance to do it. And I think if I were to look at myself and say, much like when we were talking about the concept of luck, and luck is always going to exist in the world, but if you put yourself in a position where there's nothing more that you could have done, then you sleep well at night. And I think if you extend that out over my entire life, I'd want to wake up every day knowing that there have been no regrets, and that I haven't you know I remember when I was this is a complete tangent, but I remember in like, I think year
Mm.
five English or something. I didn't get the English award for something, and I was pretty disappointed in it. And I remember my year five teacher saying, you know, you've got so much potential. It would be worthless if you didn't tap into it once in a while. And I think that's probably stuck with me ever since, because that's
Mm.
something you don't really want, right? If you can perform at your best and that's all you can do, then I think that's what drives me every day. I think the other thing as well, I do just generally think I have a pretty deep satisfaction of eventually having a career in social impact, in eventually having a recognition. And Chamath Palihapitiya, an American or Canadian investor, talks about this a lot. Um, that money drives the world, whether you like it or not. And I think to affect social change in the world requires a command of capital at some stage. And I think I have a big drive to eventually, marry my interest in venture capital with an interest in longevity and in biotech and life sciences, and being able to say that, I'm not smart enough to do the chemistry or the engineering behind it, but I potentially could, help with the capital allocation process and those sort of things. That's what drives me every day, is to take the skills that I have and to use that for the best influence of, the people around me.
Cool. No, thanks so much for sharing that with us. It's super interesting to hear, inside your life and inside your mind, and the things that you're thinking about. And I think that's really great. It's like having a positive impact on the world, and really creating the ability for yourself to do that in the future. I think is really cool. And I look forward to the positive impact that you will have eventually. I look forward to following your journey,
Come
mate.
back to me in 30 years and we'll see what's
Yeah.
happened.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, I've got one more question for you, Sharon, and that is a question I ask all the guests that come on the show, and it is, if you could kind of, let's even for yourself go back to when you were first starting university and kind of out into this journey of discovering, the different opportunities that are awaiting you, and what advice would you give to someone that's perhaps now just starting out on their journey?
Yeah, totally. I think a few things. I'll probably say three things. Have to keep it very structured as a future consultant. Um, I think the first one would be do things your own way. Um, I've mentioned the phrase hedonic treadmill a few times now, but it's very easy. And I know that I am a person who subjects this on others. Is you see the LinkedIn's of people and you say, oh, well, by doing this, he got to this, and by doing B, he got to C, and um, have a consciousness that there are a million ways to get to where you want to be, and be driven enough that you pursue goals. And if you are pursuing roles and titles and whatever it is, that's fine, but don't be so driven that you forget to, as they say, smell the roses on the way, and you
Mm.
forget about the reason why you've done that journey. And I'm not ending up in banking, but I'm still glad I've spent 1.5 years in banking, because that's taught me a whole um, skill set of things that if I was so focused on the outcome, I would think that was a waste, which it certainly isn't. So I'd say, firstly, do
Mm.
things your own way. Second thing, nobody cares. And that sounds rather flippant. But what I mean by that is genuinely nobody cares about so many of the failures that we have on a daily basis. I remember seeing this visualization once on Twitter. And if you imagine two concentric circles, and you sort of have one circle and then you have a little small circle in the middle of it, and that small circle is how much other people think about you, and all the space around it is how much you think about other people thinking about you. And that's just the
Mm.
reality, that literally nobody cares. Everyone has their own issues and problems to sort through. And it's very liberating once you realize that, because all of a sudden you're just focused on your own happiness and your personal pursuit of your goals, and that's all you need in life. I think life is already tough enough without worrying
Mm.
about what other people think, or what's going to be the impact of me not getting X or not being at this stage in life. And especially when you surround yourself in a high academic achieving background of students and cohorts, as the universities you and I have been to, it gets very easy to fall into that mental trap. And then the last thing I'd say is that life will generally be okay. And I think this sort of links back to, nobody cares. But I've said this a lot to, it's graduate season at the moment. A lot of students in the years below, some students that I tutor at university have been really stressed and worried about applications. And I think remember that everybody peaks at a certain period of time, and that's not going to be 22 for everybody, and it'd be rather sad if you're peaking at 22. So I think just remember that the vast majority of your listeners and the people who are part of this community have lived in a time which has never been better than time before, number one. And that's secondly, generally everybody, if you work hard enough, if you don't let luck impact everything in your life, you will be okay. And you will get to where you want to eventually, and that there's no rush in life in terms of reaching certain goals. And just because it seems like the vast majority of people reach goals within a certain period of time, doesn't mean that you have to be part of that as well. Because there are countless numbers of people. Reid Hoffman is a prime example, who reached their peak successes and their first successes in their 40s and 50s. So that would be my three pieces of advice. Do things your own way. Nobody cares, and it'll all be okay, James. It'll all be okay.
Amazing. No, that's really, really cool advice, and thanks so much for sharing that with us, Cheran. Because I think if people can really take that to heart, then I think it'll really help them and set them up for a more interesting and successful life. So thanks so much for sharing that with us today. If people listening want to go and find out more about yourself, perhaps they've now heard your fantastic advice on applying for roles in various different places, where is the best place for them to go and find out more about you?
Yeah, LinkedIn, my name straight onto there. Warm intros are for dinosaurs, so please just message if there's anything that I can ever help with. Otherwise, I'm on Twitter as well, Cheran K7. Probably those two places to get me.
Fantastic. Well, we'll direct people there. But thanks so much for coming on the pod today, Cheran. It's been really, really cool diving into all the things you think about. And thanks so much.
Thanks, James. This was fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to get my takeaways, the things that I learnt from this episode, please go to graduatetheory.com/subscribe, where you can get my takeaways and all the information about each episode straight to your inbox. Thanks so much for listening again today, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.